So that is great, but it would be even better if we were to build our own directive, in my opinion. So let's do this. I'll first add a horizontal line here, and then we have our custom attribute directive. And now to get going or get started with it, I will create a new terminal window and navigate it into my project folder. I can create a new directive by running ng, then G for generate, and now not C for component, but instead directive, or shorter version, just D. And I will name my directive highlight. This will generate new files for me in the app folder. And I will get rid of the test file here. But the highlight directive.ts is of course the file I'm interested in. So this is my highlight directive, and Angular 2 already created some basic setup for me. But of course this setup is very important, and therefore I want to guide through this. So a directive is a normal TypeScript class like a component is, but now instead of the component metadata or decorator, it gets the directive decorator added to it, which is also imported from Angular/core. Now we have two different decorators here because components are directives with a view. A directive like this one doesn't have a view. Therefore, we have this extra component decorator. So this directive decorator here allows us to do comparable configurations like we were able to do in a component decorator, but without a template, of course, or styling because we don't have a view. So what we do have is a selector, and this selector by default is set up to have squared brackets and then highlight. And now here's a very important key part. This might look like squared brackets here relates to squared brackets when we apply it on an element, like, right? So that we would use this directive by having, for example, here a div with squared brackets highlight. That is not the case. As mentioned before, the selectors here, as well as in the component, are used like CSS selectors. There are some things, some pseudo selectors which are not available, but in general, this is just the same as in the CSS selector. In a CSS file like this one, you would select elements by attribute. The same is true here. We're selecting elements by attribute. So only elements which have the highlight attribute, which of course isn't a built-in attribute, will be selected by this selector. This is very important to understand, that you use this like a CSS selector to define which elements should be selected or impacted by your directive here. You could of course also leave out the squared brackets to have a tag selector, like we're commonly using it with components. However, it's a standard to use the attribute, or in many cases you will, but use whatever is appropriate for you. You might of course also select by ID with a hashtag if that is more appropriate, or a dot to select by class, whatever fits your needs. So I will stick to the attribute squared brackets, which is again where the name comes from, attribute directives, but you don't have to stick there, just to make it really clear. And with that, we're applying this highlight directive to each element which has highlight added to it. So if I remove the squared brackets, now this would get the highlight directive. So I will add some text, but of course we won't see anything if I do this. This has two reasons. One is the directive isn't added yet. In the component here, I first have to import it. So I'll import the highlight directive. And this should be named highlight directive here in my opinion. So I'm importing this now, and next I can add the directives metadata here to add the highlight directive. And of course this works the same way as before when we added components, because components are directives, right? Therefore normal directives without a view are edited in the exact same way. Now we still don't see anything. or first I should save this. And of course, this should be imported from // to point to the local directory. So now this reloads and we still don't see any changes. The reason is the directive is now applied, but it doesn't do anything, right? This highlight directive isn't doing a single thing here. So let's do it something by changing the styling a bit. To do this, I'll need dependency injection, which is something I'll come back to in the module on services and dependency injection. For now, know that I can inject certain things, classes, instances of classes I need in my components directives through Angular 2's dependency injection framework, which basically means Angular 2 creates certain instances for me and I can use them. And why would something like this be needed? Well, here, for example, with the directive, I want to change something on the element this directive sits on. However, here in this file, as you can see, currently I don't have any access to this element. One way to get element is dependency injection. In the constructor of this directive, I can simply add a new argument, and I do this by giving this a name. And what I want to insert here is a reference to the element the directive sits on. So I will name this element ref, and then I specify a type element ref. I then add the import, which is also from Angular core. And what this does is it tells the Angular 2 framework, hey, when you create this directive, and Angular 2 creates it because it gets the instruction to create it, I need this argument of type element reference. Now Angular 2 will have a look if it knows how to create this reference. And it does know how to create this, because in this case, element reference happens to be an object referring to the element the directive is added to. Therefore, Angular 2 will create or will give us the instance of this class, which in this case is simply a reference to the element the directive is applied to. And we need this to interact with this element. So this is one thing. We now got this injected. However, it would be great to be able to use it throughout this directive here later on. Therefore, I can create a new private property here, which I would call private element ref, which would also be of type element ref. And then in the body of this constructor, I could set element ref equal to the injected element ref here. This would work. However, a shorter way TypeScript offers is to get rid of all that code and just add private here in the constructor argument list. This basically does the same as you just saw. It creates the private element ref property and automatically assigns the injected value. So really just a shortcut. Now, in order to actually see something, I access this element ref, so this private property I'm automatically setting here. Then I access the native element behind that reference. So the reference is referring to an element, and by accessing the native element, I access this referred to element itself. And this is just an HTML element. Therefore, I can now access the style property and then, for example, background color. So this is plain JavaScript HTML element coding I'm doing here. And I could set this equal to green. And this would, if this page reloads, give this a green background. So that works. However, this is not really how you should do it. Because if you access the native element directly and fiddle around with the styling here, this brings certain disadvantages. One of them is that Angular 2 offers you the chance to run your code in several environments, not only in your browser. And while I won't go into more detail there, be aware that there is a better way to manipulate the styling or the content of your view without it being complicated. So it has no real disadvantages, but in some cases it has advantages. This is done through a service Angular 2 offers you named renderer. This also has to be injected. So I will add a new injection here, private renderer, which refers to the renderer, and I have to import that, of course, too. Now that renderer here, I'm going to comment out the old code, will allow me to use it, renderer, to then set the element style of something, and then I have to pass the element which I want to style, which is of course my reference and then the native element. The next is a string, which is the style name, so background color for example, and then the value of the style, green. So now if I save this, you see that you get the very same result, but this time this is a clean code which also covers some cases where the first commented out code would fail.